The silent extinction. The first mind went silent at exactly 1427 Galactic Standard Time on the peaceful world of Resonance Prime. Ambassador Kyra 9 felt it happen through the collective consciousness network that connected her crystal mind civilization to 17 other telepathic species across the Zephyrian collective. One moment, the thoughts of Dr. Velhar were contributing to a philosophical discussion about quantum meditation, and the next moment, there was simply nothing. Kyra 9's crystalline form shimmered with concern as she reached out through the mind web, her consciousness flowing like liquid light through the neural pathways that connected billions of thinking beings across 3 star systems. The silence where Dr. Velhar's mind should have been felt like a void, an absence so complete it made her entire being recoil. Within minutes, more minds began disappearing. Not dying, which would have left the familiar echo of fading thoughts, but simply ceasing to exist as if they had never been. The collective consciousness that had united the Zephyrian species for over 1,000 years began developing holes, dark spots where vibrant minds had once contributed to the grand symphony of telepathic civilization. On her homeworld of Crystal Nexus, Kyra 9 convened an emergency session of the Collective Council. Representatives from the Thought Swimmers of Aqua Prime, the Dream Weavers of Misty Reaches, and the Memory Keepers of Archive World gathered in the Great Crystal Amphitheater, their minds linking across vast distances to share their growing terror. The Mind Dancers of Harmony Station were the first to report seeing them. Through the shared consciousness network, Kyra 9 experienced the memory directly. The creatures appeared as shadows given form, moving through space without ships, feeding on the very essence of thought itself. They flowed like liquid darkness between the stars, reaching worlds, and simply consuming every thinking being they encountered. Elder Quinn-12 of the Memory Keepers accessed the deep archives, his ancient mind sifting through millennia of recorded history. The memory crystals revealed nothing like these creatures in all their vast knowledge. They seemed to exist outside the natural order, parasites that fed not on matter or energy, but on consciousness itself. The first military response came from the Thought Swimmers, whose warrior philosophers had maintained peace in the outer sectors for centuries. Admiral Kesnal led a fleet of mind-linked vessels toward the affected systems, their crews working in perfect telepathic harmony. They encountered the shadow creatures at the edge of the Spiral Nebula, and the battle that followed defied all understanding of warfare. The creatures, which the survivors would later call Silence Wraiths, moved through space like living nightmares. They ignored physical attacks entirely, phasing through plasma bolts and energy beams as if they were nothing. Instead, they reached out with tendrils of pure absence, touching the minds of the Thought Swimmer crews and simply erasing them from existence. Admiral Kesnal's final transmission reached the Collective Council as his flagship burned around him. "The creatures they learned from us," he reported, his mental voice growing weaker by the moment. "Every tactic we use, every thought form we deploy, they absorb and turn against us. They're not just eating our minds, they're stealing our knowledge, becoming stronger with each consciousness they consume." The transmission ended abruptly, leaving behind only the psychic scream of an entire fleet's worth of minds being snuffed out like candles in a hurricane. Panic spread through the collective consciousness as system after system went dark. The Dreamweavers tried to confuse the creatures with false realities and mental illusions, but the Wraiths adapted within hours, turning the Dreamweavers' own nightmares against them. The Mind Dancers attempted to overwhelm the creatures with pure emotional force, flooding them with love, joy, and hope, but the Wraiths consumed these feelings and grew stronger still. Kyra 9 watched helplessly as the great mind web that had connected her people for generations began to collapse. Entire worlds went silent, their populations simply vanishing without trace. Refugee fleets streamed toward the core worlds, carrying survivors whose minds had been partially touched by the Wraiths, leaving them hollow-eyed and capable of only the most basic thoughts. The medical centers on Crystal Nexus overflowed with victims who had survived close encounters with the creatures. Dr. Lisford examined them with growing horror, discovering that the wraiths didn't just consume consciousness, they left behind something far worse. The survivors' minds contained fragments of the creature's alien intelligence, viral thoughts that tried to rewrite their victims' very identity. By the third week of what historians would later call the Silent War, half the collective's territory had fallen. The remaining species huddled in their core worlds, desperately trying to devise weapons that could fight an enemy that existed primarily in the realm of thought and consciousness. It was then that Kyra 9 remembered the humans. 57 years earlier, the Zephyrian collective had encountered Earth during humanity's expansion into space. First contact had been a disaster of epic proportions. The humans, unable to communicate telepathically, had been utterly alien to the mind-linked civilizations of the collective. Worse, their thoughts were chaotic, violent, and completely resistant to telepathic influence. When territorial disputes arose with the Bone Nour Empire in the Outer Rim, the collective had requested human assistance, hoping their strange mental immunity might prove useful. The humans had agreed, but their methods of warfare had horrified every civilized species in the galaxy. Human soldiers didn't just fight to win, they fought to break their enemies' will to resist. They used psychological warfare, terror tactics, and showed no mercy to those who threatened them. During the siege of Skullbreaker Station, human forces had done things that violated every principle of civilized conduct. They poisoned the station's water supply, used biological weapons that caused agonizing death, and when the Bone Nours attempted to surrender, the humans had simply stated that they didn't take prisoners from species that ate children. The aftermath had been swift and decisive. Every major power in the galaxy had voted to quarantine humanity within their own solar system. They were deemed too dangerous, too unpredictable, and too willing to commit atrocities to be allowed among civilized species. For 57 years, no ship had crossed the barriers surrounding Sol's system, and humanity had been left alone with their violence and their wars. Now, as Kyra 9 watched another star system fall silent on the tactical displays, she realized that humanity's greatest weakness might be exactly what the galaxy needed. The Silence Wraiths fed on consciousness, absorbed telepathic energy, and grew stronger from every mind they touched. But humans weren't telepathic. Their chaotic, violent thoughts might be the only thing immune to the creature's power. The debate in the council chambers was brief and desperate. Elder Quinn-12 argued that involving humans would be like fighting fire with nuclear weapons, potentially solving one problem while creating a far worse one. The Dream Weavers worried that humanity's violent nature would corrupt the peaceful civilization they had built. But as another system's worth of minds vanished from the collective consciousness, the choice became clear. They needed monsters to fight monsters. Kyra 9 personally authorized the transmission that would break 57 years of quarantine. Her crystalline form pulsed with desperate energy as she activated the emergency communication array, sending humanity their first contact from galactic civilization since the exile. The message was simple and terrible in its honesty. The Zephyrian collective formally requested immediate military assistance against an enemy that consumed consciousness itself. Their telepathic weapons were useless, their peaceful nature was being turned against them, and millions died with each passing hour. They needed beings whose minds were too chaotic, too violent, and too alien for the wraiths to consume. As the transmission crossed the void toward Sol's system, Kyra 9 felt the weight of history on her crystalline shoulders. They were about to unleash the one species the galaxy had deemed too dangerous to exist alongside civilized beings. But as she watched more systems fall silent on the tactical display, she knew they had no choice. Sometimes, when facing absolute evil, you needed to call upon the monsters. The response came 18 hours later, carried by quantum communication arrays that had been silent for over half a century. The voice that answered was cold, professional, and completely without the telepathic warmth that characterized all civilized communication. General Thane Morrison of the Terran Defense Force acknowledged the collective's request with mechanical precision. His words would be remembered by every survivor of the Silent War. We're coming. Stay alive until we get there. The merciless solution. The human fleet materialized at the edge of Zephyrian space like death itself given form. General Thane Morrison stood on the bridge of the dreadnought Inevitable Consequence, watching the tactical displays update with cold satisfaction. 300 vessels had answered the collective's call, each one a predator designed by a species that had never stopped preparing for war. Morrison was a tall man with gray hair and eyes like winter ice, his uniform bearing the scars of conflicts the galaxy had forgotten. Behind him, his staff worked with quiet efficiency, their minds closed to telepathic contact not by choice, but by evolution. Humanity had developed in isolation from telepathic species, their thoughts protected by neural pathways that operated on entirely different principles. Captain Elena Vasquez materialized on the bridge's holographic display, her image transmitted from the assault ship Necessary Evil. Morrison had served with Vasquez for 23 years, and her reputation for ruthless efficiency was legendary even among humans. She commanded the Void Hunters, humanity's most elite special operations unit, soldiers trained to fight in conditions that would break lesser beings. General, we're detecting massive psychic disturbances throughout the sector, Vasquez reported, her voice carrying the flat tone of a professional killer. Whatever these wraiths are, they're unlike anything in our combat databases. Our psychic isolation protocols are holding, but the enemy appears to be feeding on conscious thought itself. Morrison nodded, studying the sensor readings that showed the aftermath of the silent war. Entire star systems showed no signs of life, their worlds stripped clean of every thinking being. The few survivors clustered around heavily shielded installations, their telepathic communications reduced to terrified whispers. Ambassador Kyra 9's crystalline form appeared on the main screen, her thoughts translated into audible speech by the communication interface. Morrison could see the desperation in her alien features, the way her crystalline structure flickered with barely contained panic. General Morrison, we are grateful beyond measure for your response, she transmitted. The Silence Wraiths have consumed 12 star systems in the past month. Our greatest weapons are useless against them. They feed on consciousness itself, growing stronger with every mind they devour. Morrison's expression remained unchanged as he processed the information. His staff had already briefed him on the enemy's capabilities, and the tactical situation was both simple and terrible. The galaxy's telepathic species had built their entire civilization around connected consciousness, making them perfectly vulnerable to creatures that consumed minds. Understood, Ambassador, Morrison replied, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. We've reviewed your tactical data. The enemy adapts to telepathic assault because they feed on conscious thought. Fortunately, human consciousness operates on different principles entirely. What Morrison didn't explain was why humanity had evolved with such chaotic, telepathically resistant minds. Earth had been a brutal proving ground, where survival required the ability to deceive, mislead, and outthink predators both animal and human. The human brain had developed layers of conscious and unconscious thought, defense mechanisms that made telepathic contact nearly impossible. The first engagement came 6 hours later, when the Wraiths detected the human fleet's arrival. Morrison watched through the tactical display as dozens of the shadow creatures flowed through space toward his ships, their forms rippling with absorbed psychic energy from the civilizations they had consumed. All ships, implement Protocol Omega, Morrison commanded. Weapons free. No quarter given. The human response was immediate and devastating. Unlike the energy weapons that the collective had used, human ships deployed kinetic projectiles, nuclear warheads, and exotic matter weapons that operated on purely physical principles. The Wraiths, expecting to absorb and redirect psychic energy, found themselves faced with simple, brutal physics. Captain Vasquez led the initial assault, her Void Hunters deploying in small craft designed to operate in the most hostile environments imaginable. As the shadow creatures attempted to touch the humans' minds, they encountered something unprecedented, thoughts so chaotic and layered that they couldn't find purchase. Human consciousness, shaped by millions of years of warfare and survival, operated on multiple levels simultaneously. Surface thoughts masked deeper intentions, which in turn concealed primal survival instincts that had been honed by constant conflict. The wraiths, accustomed to the ordered, connected minds of telepathic species, found themselves trying to consume a storm of contradictory impulses and hidden motivations. "Sir, the enemy is having difficulty processing human neural patterns," reported Lieutenant Commander Sarah Kim from the sensor station. "Their feeding mechanisms appear designed for telepathic consciousness. Our minds don't register as valid targets." Morrison allowed himself a cold smile. Humanity's greatest weakness, their inability to form telepathic connections, had become their ultimate strength. The creatures that had effortlessly consumed the galaxy's most advanced civilizations couldn't even properly perceive human thoughts. But the wraiths were learning. Morrison watched as they began to adapt, their forms shifting to accommodate the strange new prey they had encountered. Some began targeting human ships with purely physical attacks, while others attempted to overwhelm human defenses through sheer numbers. It was then that Morrison implemented humanity's most terrible weapon, psychological warfare on a galactic scale. "Deploy the consciousness bombs," he ordered, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. The weapons that humanity had developed during their exile were unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Where other species had focused on energy and matter manipulation, humans had weaponized the very concept of consciousness itself. The consciousness bombs were devices that broadcast pure, undiluted human thought patterns, projected at frequencies that telepathic beings found utterly terrifying. Captain Vasquez led the deployment personally, her ship dropping the weapons into the heart of the wraith swarm. When they detonated, they didn't produce explosions or energy discharges. Instead, they flooded local space with the chaotic neural patterns of humanity's most violent warriors, thoughts so alien and brutal that even the silence wraiths recoiled. The broadcast thoughts contained no mercy, no hesitation, and no limit to the violence humans were willing to inflict on their enemies. They were the mental patterns of soldiers who had fought on 1,000 worlds, who had faced impossible odds and emerged victorious through sheer bloody-minded determination. To telepathic beings, they were the mental equivalent of staring into an active volcano. The wraiths, creatures that fed on consciousness, suddenly found themselves faced with thoughts they couldn't consume. Human neural patterns were too chaotic, too violent, and too alien for their feeding mechanisms to process. Worse, the broadcast thoughts began to corrupt the psychic energy they had already absorbed, turning their stolen power into a poison that ate away at their coherence. "Direct hit on the primary swarm," Vasquez reported, her voice carrying grim satisfaction. "Enemy creatures are showing signs of neural collapse. They're unable to process the broadcast patterns." Morrison watched as the shadow creatures writhed in space, their forms beginning to dissolve as they tried unsuccessfully to digest the alien thoughts flooding their systems. The collected consciousness of dozens of civilizations, which they had consumed over the past month, began to rebel against its captors, aided by the chaotic influence of human thought patterns. But victory came at a price. The consciousness bombs affected every telepathic being within their range, including the collective's own forces. Kyra 9's desperate transmission reached the human fleet as her people suffered under the weight of humanity's projected thoughts. "General Morrison, your weapons are causing massive psychic trauma to our survivors," she pleaded. "Our people are experiencing your soldiers' memories directly. The violence, the brutality, it's more than our minds can bear." Morrison's response was immediate and uncompromising. "Then withdraw to safe distance, Ambassador. We're fighting this war by human rules now." The final battle lasted 17 hours and was unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed. Human forces, immune to the wraith's primary weapon, hunted the creatures through the wreckage of fallen civilizations. They showed no mercy, no hesitation, and no quarter. When wraiths attempted to hide among the ruins of consumed worlds, human soldiers pursued them with relentless determination. Captain Vasquez personally led the assault on the Wraith Nest ship, a massive construct built from the absorbed consciousness of an entire star system. Her void hunters moved through the vessel like death itself, their thoughts too chaotic for the remaining creatures to affect, their weapons designed to kill without hesitation. In the ship's core, they found the source of the infestation, a collective consciousness that had been feeding on telepathic species for millennia, growing stronger with each civilization it consumed. Vask stood before the entity, her mind completely closed to its influence, and spoke the words that would end the silent war. "You made one mistake," she said, priming the final consciousness bomb. "You chose to fight humanity." The detonation that followed could be felt across 3 star systems, a psychic shockwave that scattered the remaining wraiths and freed the consciousness they had stolen. For the first time in weeks, the telepathic networks of the collective began to reconnect, carrying the voices of billions who had been thought lost forever. In the aftermath, as human forces systematically hunted down the scattered remains of the Wraith swarm, Ambassador Kara 9 transmitted a message that would change the galaxy's relationship with humanity forever. "We called you monsters," she said, her crystalline form flickering with new understanding. "We exiled you because we couldn't understand your violence, your willingness to do whatever was necessary to survive. But now we see the truth. You're not monsters at all. You're guardians, shaped by a universe that taught you to be harder than anything it could throw at you." General Morrison's response carried the weight of 57 years of exile and the satisfaction of vindication. "We told you once that we didn't need your approval to exist, Ambassador, but we're willing to stand between you and anything that threatens civilization. That's what humans do. We fight the things that decent people can't." The quarantine around Sol system was lifted 3 days later, but humanity didn't immediately rejoin galactic civilization. They had learned to thrive in isolation, and the galaxy would have to earn their trust all over again. But when the next threat emerged from the void between stars, when the next enemy arose that couldn't be reasoned with or negotiated with, every species in the galaxy knew who to call. Sometimes the universe required monsters to protect the innocent, and humanity had proven that they were exactly the kind of monsters the galaxy needed.